He was a man who was born into unimaginable wealth, a man who inherited a vast fortune at the age of 19, a man who could have spent his life in idle luxury, surrounded by the finest things that money could buy. He was a man who was a recluse, a man who was terrified of germs, a man who would spend years locked in a darkened room, never bathing, never cutting his hair or his fingernails, watching the same movies over and over again, a man who would communicate with his employees only through notes passed under a door. He was a man who was one of the most brilliant aviators of his generation, a man who broke speed records, a man who flew around the world, a man who designed and built some of the most advanced aircraft of his time. He was a man who was a movie producer, a man who made some of the most controversial and influential films of his era, a man who was a playboy, a man who dated the most beautiful actresses in Hollywood, a man who was a recluse, a man who was a visionary, and a man who was a prisoner of his own mind. This is the story of Howard Hughes, a man whose life was a study in extremes, a man who soared to the greatest heights of success and plunged into the deepest depths of madness, a man who was a genius and a madman, a hero and a villain, a man whose story continues to fascinate and mystify us to this day. But here is what most people do not realize about Howard Hughes. The man who is remembered as the reclusive billionaire, the man who was the subject of countless rumors and legends, was a man who was deeply driven, a man who was determined to make his mark on the world, a man who was constantly pushing the boundaries of what was possible, a man who was haunted by a deep and abiding sense of loneliness, a man who was a victim of his own obsessions, a man who was a prisoner of his own wealth, a man who was not just a madman, but a man who was deeply human, a man who was shaped by the tragedies of his life, a man who was a visionary whose contributions to aviation and film are still felt today. To understand Howard Hughes, you have to go back to the beginning, to the sweltering heat of Houston, Texas, where he was born on December 24, 1905, into a world of immense wealth and privilege. His father, Howard Hughes Sr., was a self-made man, a brilliant inventor and entrepreneur who had created a revolutionary oil drilling bit that had made him a fortune. The Hughes Tool Company was a thriving business, and the family was one of the wealthiest in the state. His mother, Alanie Stone Gano, was a woman of refinement and class, a woman who was deeply protective of her son, a woman who was determined to shield him from the harsh realities of the world. Howard was a delicate child, a boy who was often sick, a boy who was prone to infections and illnesses. He was a boy who was deeply attached to his mother, a boy who was terrified of the world outside his comfortable home. He was a boy who was raised in a bubble of privilege, a boy who was told that he was special, a boy who was taught that he was destined for greatness. But he was also a boy who was deeply lonely, a boy who had few friends, a boy who was not interested in the rough and tumble of schoolyard games. He was a boy who was more interested in machines, in engines, in the intricate workings of the mechanical world. He was a boy who was developing a fascination with aviation, a fascination that would become the driving force of his life. He was a boy who was building his first radio transmitter at the age of 11, and he was a boy who was taking apart and reassembling engines before he was a teenager. Hughes was a mediocre student. He was not interested in the traditional subjects, and he often skipped class to pursue his own interests. He was a young man who was determined to follow his own path, a young man who was not willing to be constrained by the expectations of others. When his father died suddenly in 1924, Hughes was just 19 years old, and he inherited the Hughes Tool Company. He was now one of the wealthiest young men in the country, a man who had the resources to pursue his wildest dreams. He was a man who was determined to make his mark on the world, and he was a man who was not afraid to take risks. He dropped out of college and he moved to California, the land of opportunity and dreams. He was a man who was determined to build an empire, a man who was determined to become a legend. He began to pursue his two great passions, aviation and film. He was a man who was obsessed with the art of storytelling, and he began to produce films that were ambitious, innovative, and deeply personal. He produced a series of films, including The Racket, The Mating Call, and Hell's Angels, a film that would become one of the most expensive and ambitious films of its time. Hell's Angels was a film about World War I aviators, and it featured some of the most spectacular aerial sequences ever filmed. Hughes was deeply involved in every aspect of the production, and he was determined to make the film as realistic and as thrilling as possible. He spent years on the film, and he spared no expense. He bought a fleet of planes, and he hired some of the best pilots in the world. He was a man who was willing to sacrifice everything for his art, a man who was willing to take risks that other producers would not consider. The film was a huge success, and it established Hughes as a major figure in Hollywood. He was a man who was making his mark on the world, a man who was becoming a legend. But his true passion was aviation. He was a man who was obsessed with the sky, a man who was determined to push the boundaries of flight. He designed and built some of the most advanced aircraft of his time, and he set a series of speed records that would stand for years. In 1935, he flew a plane that he had designed himself, the H-1 Racer, to a speed of 352 miles per hour, a world record. He was a man who was not afraid to risk his life to achieve his goals. He was a man who was constantly pushing himself to the limit, a man who was never satisfied with the status quo. In 1938, he set a new speed record for a transcontinental flight, flying from Los Angeles to New York in just over 7 hours. He was a man who was a hero, a man who was celebrated by the press and the public. He was a man who was at the height of his powers, a man who was achieving everything he had ever dreamed of. But the seeds of his downfall were already being planted. Hughes had a series of accidents, including a near-fatal plane crash in 1946. He was flying an experimental aircraft, and the plane crashed into a neighborhood in Los Angeles. He was severely injured, suffering burns, broken bones, and a crushed lung. He was in a coma for days, and he was in pain for months. It was a moment of profound vulnerability, a moment that would trigger his descent into madness. He was a man who was forced to confront his own mortality, a man who was forced to confront the limits of his own body. He was a man who was becoming increasingly isolated, a man who was withdrawing from the world. He began to develop obsessive-compulsive disorder, a condition that would come to define his life. He became terrified of germs, and he would spend hours washing his hands. He would eat only a few specific foods, and he would not allow anyone to touch him. He was a man who was becoming a prisoner of his own mind, a man who was losing touch with reality. The final decades of Hughes's life were a descent into madness. He became a recluse, locking himself in darkened rooms, rarely seeing anyone, and communicating only through notes. He would watch the same movies over and over again, some of them hundreds of times. He was a man who was obsessed with his own health, a man who was convinced that he was being poisoned by his enemies. He was a man who was addicted to painkillers, a man who was constantly seeking relief from his physical and emotional pain. He was a man who was a prisoner of his own wealth, a man who was surrounded by people who were more interested in his money than in his well-being. He was a man who was alone, a man who was isolated, a man who was dying a slow and painful death. He spent his final years in seclusion, moving from one hotel room to another, shunning the world that had once celebrated him. In 1976, he died of kidney failure on a plane, surrounded by his employees, a man who was still flying, a man who was still searching for something that he could never find. He was 70 years old. The legacy of Howard Hughes is one of the most complex in American history. He was a brilliant aviator and a visionary businessman, a man who made significant contributions to the fields of aviation and film. He was a man who pushed the boundaries of what was possible, a man who was willing to take risks that others would not consider. He was a man who was a symbol of American ingenuity and ambition. He was also a man who was deeply troubled, a man who was haunted by his own demons, a man who was a victim of his own obsessions. He was a man who was a recluse, a man who was a prisoner of his own wealth, a man who was a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of mental health. He was a man who was a legend, a man whose life has been the subject of countless books, films, and documentaries. Why should someone born today still care about Howard Hughes? because his life is a testament to the power of ambition and the importance of resilience. He was a man who overcame tremendous obstacles, a man who was not afraid to take risks, a man who was determined to achieve greatness. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the obstacles we face, but the way we respond to them. He was a man who showed us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who believed in the power of the human will, and he was a man who was not afraid to dream. He was a man who changed the world, and his story will continue to inspire generations to come. But his story is also a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation and the importance of human connection. He was a man who had everything, and yet he was a man who had nothing. He was a man who was surrounded by people, but he was a man who was completely alone. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the wealth we accumulate, but the relationships we build. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the success we achieve, but the difference we make in the world. He was a man who was a hero and a villain, a genius and a madman, a man who was deeply human, a man who was shaped by his contradictions. He was a man who taught us that the most important thing is not the obstacles we face, but the way we respond to them. He was a man who showed us that even in the darkest hour, hope is possible, and that the human spirit is indomitable. He was a man who changed the world, and he will never be forgotten. He was a man who showed us that the most powerful force in the world is not violence, but the will to succeed, the will to overcome, the will to build something new. He was a man who was not just a businessman. He was a man who was a visionary, a pioneer, a legend, and a cautionary tale. He was a man whose story will continue to fascinate and inspire us for generations to come. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the success we achieve, but the difference we make in the world. He was a man who showed us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who was not just a hero. He was a man who was a legend, a man whose story will continue to inspire generations to come. He was a man who taught us that the most important thing is not the obstacles we face, but the way we respond to them. He was a man who showed us that even in the darkest hour, hope is possible, and that the human spirit is indomitable. He was a man who changed the world, and he will never be forgotten.